I'm Rick Barkley, and this is a tutorial on some basic music theory concepts. What we'll be talking about today are four main topics: the staff, the different clefs, names of notes, and ledger lines. So let's go ahead and dive in. The first aspect is the music staff. Basically, it's comprised of 5 lines and 4 spaces. The spaces are considered in between those 5 lines. The areas outside of those 5 lines are not considered any part of the technical 4 spaces. They're what I call the no man's land, and we'll get into more of why I call it that and the names of those as we proceed on through this tutorial. Okay, notes are basically, when I say that they're on the line, it's actually being intersected through the line, as opposed to don't put the note on top of the line when I say on the line, because you don't want to do that because there are actually notes in that space. I had a student one time at a college that I was teaching at that he misunderstood me, and he literally thought when I said note on the line that it was being placed on top of the line. So he was one off on everything, and I couldn't figure it out until basically we had a private one-on-one conversation, and there was a reveal at that point. So ever since then, I've been very, I guess, aware to make sure that I tell people when it says notes on the line, literally the line is intersecting it. So really the note's in the middle of the line, or the line is in the middle of the note if you want to consider that. So that's some clarification on what we mean by that. Okay. So now let's dig into the clefs. There's various different clefs, and the first one that we'll talk about is the treble clef. These were basically calligraphy type of artwork, if you will, that were done in the 1700s and have become the staples of what we consider are denoting what notes are on those lines and spaces, the names of them. And so it's very important of taking note of the, the clef whenever you are reading music. So the first one, treble clef, it's also known as a G clef. And the reason that it is known as G clef is because that little curlicue, a circular area, if you will, in the body of that clef sign is encasing the second line from the bottom. And that is signifying that that is where the note G belongs. And from there, we are able to label and name the spaces and lines within the treble clef. And we'll get into that later on in this tutorial. But for now, treble clef is also known as G clef because of that little scenario there with the artwork of the treble clef's insignia. All right, the next one is called bass clef. It's also known as the F clef, and again, it's because of the big dot that starts this little 9-looking symbol, if you will, is on the second space, or second line, excuse me, from the top, and the 2 dots encasing that line, basically it's giving signal that that second line from the top is F. So from that, we name all the different notes of the lines and spaces. And again, we'll get into it a little bit later in this tutorial. Okay, some other alternative clefs that you will see, and not necessarily in basic music theory get into very much, but going to make you aware of these different clefs. It's known as the alto clef, but it also kind of has another name as movable C clef. And the reason for that is that, again, this little insignia or calligraphy that you will that was created, that little indention is signifying, in this case, that the middle line is C. Now, these clefs, movable C clefs, can move all over the place. This particular one, because of where it's located, it's known as the alto clef. Alto voices sometimes will be written in this. Viola And also sometimes the cello can be written in this way. And there's various different reasons for that, uh, because we're going to get into what's called ledger lines. This helps eliminate so many different ledger lines, and that will become clear to you why that's kind of desired later on. Okay, so here's some other of the C clefs. As you see, again, the first one up there on the top, it's signifying that that top line is C, and the bottom one there is saying that that bottom line is C. Okay, so that's your other movable C clefs, and again, we can literally move this thing on every single one of those lines, and that indicates that that is C. Okay, another type of clef that is very commonly used these days is a percussion clef. Basically, it's two vertical lines that go down, between the second line from the top and the second line from the bottom, and kind of looks like a Roman numeral 2 in a way, and that indicates percussion. For the longest time, bass clef was used for percussion staff, but this has kind of become the norm now. And basically it's indicating that there's no pitch. And this will be for like drum sets, snare drum, bongos, any handheld percussion, things of that nature. You would use this clef. It would not be used for things such as timpani or chimes, bells, any of the mallet instruments, because they have pitch, and there are notes that are being played that are in conjunction with other notes of the orchestra and piano and things such as that. And also sometimes a percussion clef, it'll be kind of a rectangular box in the same area, but more so now often you're seeing those two thick lines that kind of look like the Roman numeral 2. Okay, so now this kind of ventures us into the names of the notes. So we'll tackle this clef by clef. And before we do that, we'll talk about the letters that are used. Basically, the letters of the alphabet are A through G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There is no note I or note M, note L or note O, any of those different other letters. We just use these letters and these only. Now there's ways of increasing these names by use of accidentals, and that's another tutorial. But for now, we're going to stick with just the basic bare A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Okay? So, starting with treble clef, we're going to deal with the names of the lines. The first one, starting from the bottom, is E. Second line from the bottom is G. Middle line is B. Next to the top line is D. And then the top line is F. Okay, so there's a little saying of every good boy does fine that will help you remember the names of the lines of the treble clef. E, G, B, D, F. Every good boy does fine. Now, if you want to come up with some other kind of saying that helps you, then by all means go ahead. But this is kind of one of the staple, standard ones that has been around for a long time. Okay, so now let's go to the names of the spaces. The bottom space is F. Second space from the bottom is A. Next space is C. And then the top space is E. And remember, those other areas outside the lines not considered part of the spaces. So it's just those four, and it spells face. So that's pretty easy to remember. F-A-C-E. Face. Okay, now those no man land area that I was telling you about, because the top line is F, then that means that next area outside there is a G. And then if you go down below, this is going in reverse order now because that bottom line is E, then D is that other no man's land space, if you will. Not really a space, I want to clarify that, but just that no man's land. So because the alphabet is going in order with these notes, D, E, so on and so forth, that's why the bottom one is a D. Okay, this will make more sense as we put both clefs together just a little bit later on here. Okay, so now when we put all of them together, there you can see, starting from that no man's land, D, E, F, G, and notice that my G is in red, and I did that on purpose, was to show you that it's also known as the G clef, and because that letter name is G, signifying that clef symbol, it makes all these notes go in that order and everything makes sense. Okay, so you can see it all the way from the lines and spaces, including those no man's land. Okay. So next one now is bass clef. So let's start with the names of the lines. The first line from the bottom, going bottom up, is G. Second line from the bottom is B. Middle line is D. We have F. And then the top line is A. Again, another little saying that we have is good boys do fine always. I also learned it as good boys deserve fudge. Always, good boys deserve fudge always. And whatever else you want to come up with that helps you remember, that's fine. But good boys do fine always is a common one that is out there. Okay, so now let's deal with the spaces. Again, the spaces are inside those 5 lines. So the first space, the bottom space going bottom to top, is A. Second space from the bottom is C, E, and then the top space is G. And a little saying for that is all cars eat gas. Another one that I remember growing up as a kid was all cows eat grass. Now, all of us don't own a cow, so most of us have a car. And that's an easy one for us to understand, so that's pretty much commonplace in our society these days. Okay, so again, those no man land notes, no man's land if you want to consider the plural there. The bottom one is F. Now if you take that bottom line, it's G, and again, going in reverse order makes that area an F. So you put it in alphabetical order, F, G, so on and so forth. And then the top no man's land area is a B, because that top line is an A. Alright, so we put them all together, going from the no man's land, including all the lines and spaces. You have F going all the way up to the B. And again, that next to the last line up from the top, there is the F, and again, that's why this is also known as the F clef, indicating that that line is F, and it makes all those notes surrounding it make sense and in logical order. Okay, so now this gets us into another, it's a little more difficult to understand, but it's an important part of placing notes, because we can have notes that go outside the area, the 5 lines and 4 spaces. And the way that we do that is by adding what we call ledger lines. It's spelled L-E-G-E-R, but also L-E-D-G-E-R. So you'll see it both ways, and both ways are correct spelling. But ledger lines, basically, they extend the staff above and below the 5 lines and 4 spaces, as I indicated here with the 2 lines that I drew, indicating there with the blue arrows. Now, we can have several. And it can go pretty crazy. Violinists, harp players, flute players, flautists, they're used to seeing things that, I've seen it kind of crazy, just, 5 and 6 ledger lines just going way up, and they're in the stratosphere. And that's because they can play up there, and they're accustomed to that, and they understand how to play that. And one of the reasons that it is commonly used within, for example, violin playing is because as they go up in a higher register, there's different fingerings that are used, as opposed to if they see it inside the staff and then 8VA is written above it. We'll discuss what 8VA means in another tutorial, but it's, as it was explained to me by a violinist one time, that it's really easier for them to see it within those ledger lines way up there, as opposed to inside the staff, and then they have to convert their thinking with fingering. It's just kind of too much processing going on, so they prefer this. Anyway, that's kind of the explanation for the ledger lines. Again, it extends things above and below. So yes, there are spaces in between those lines, and it's not just notes with intersecting those lines, but there are areas just like the spaces within your 5 lines and 4 spaces there are quote-unquote spaces in between those ledger lines. So there is more to it than just those lines. So when we start putting names to them, it all kind of connects together. So I'm going to go from the bottom up to the top. The very bottom one of that third ledger line from the bottom is F, and then the space is G. Second ledger line from the bottom is A, the space is B, and then we have C. And I put that in red for a reason, and we'll come to that here in the next couple of slides. So going on up, the first ledger line above the top line is A, and then that space, quote-unquote space, is B. Second ledger line is C, then we have the space of D, and then the top ledger line is E. And again, we could just keep going on and on and on. As long as we keep everything in alphabetical order, it all makes sense. Okay, now, the one that I had highlighted in red, this is what's known as middle C. And as we're going to I was going to use the word C, not meaning to confuse us, but as we will become aware within the bass clef, there is also a middle C within bass clef. So as we continue along here, it'll make sense of why we consider this to be middle C. So just be aware of that. I highlighted it in red, and we'll address it here in just a few minutes. Okay? So in bass clef, we can have the same concept. I just went ahead and added all the ledger lines, and again, it can go crazy. It extends the staff, again, above and below the original 5 and 4. And it can go crazy as well. So I put the names of the notes. Let's start from the bottom up to the top. The third ledger line from the bottom is A, and then that quote-unquote space area is B. Then we have C, D, E, and then that no man's land would be F, and then we continue on in. See how it continues, and it makes sense with what we've learned of the original 5 and 4. Okay, and then that top ledger line, going up to the top, if you will, notice that it's C, and I put it in red for a reason. And that space up there is D, and then the second ledger line on the top is E, space is F, and then the tippy top ledger line is G. Okay, again, middle C, there is a location of that within bass clef, highlighted in red, and we're about to find out why this is considered that. It's because of the grand staff. Okay, grand staffs, or sometimes I've seen books where they call it the great staff. For the longest time, it's been known as the grand staff, so I'm going to refer to it as that. Basically, what it does is it connects two different staffs or staves together and groups them and says that this person is responsible for both of these. The most common way that you will see it is with the treble on the top and then bass on the bottom. Now, we can have treble and treble, we can have bass and bass, we can have any number of different combinations, and it's still considered a grand staff. This is the most common, and you're going to see it being utilized with piano and marimba sometime, organ, those type of instrumentations. Now, the next thing I just showed you there, and I encased it, was basically what connects these guys together is a bracket. And that bracket is that little curlicue thing. And it says basically that those two clefs are connected together, and again, this person is responsible for both parts, as opposed to someone playing one and someone else doing the other. Okay? Connects them together. So, when we do that, I put the names of the notes now that we have learned, including the no man's land area, okay? So, I'm going to skip on to the next one, and then we're going to talk about all the notes. Look what happens when we put middle C right in the middle. If we go from the very bottom of the bass clef in the no man's land area, all the way up to that B, again, no man's land area, and then that middle ledger line is C. That middle C is the same note in the bass clef as it is in the treble clef. If we were to play this on the piano, it is the same note. Now, when a piano player sees this middle C, it's usually not smack dab in the middle of both clefs here, like what you have indicated. Usually it is more towards one clef than the other, and the reason for that is that it indicates really which hand do you want to be playing this middle C. If it's closer to the bass clef, usually that means your left hand. Closer to the treble clef, your right hand. For this visualization purpose and demonstration, I put it right smack dab in the middle, trying to show you that basically that middle C is called that for a reason, and that it basically connects both of these clefs together into one grand fashion, so that as we go alphabetically, everything makes sense all the way from that bottom F of the bass clef up to the top G of the treble clef. Everything connects and makes sense. We learned it in pieces, and we learned it in pieces so that it's easier for you to take grasp and hold of face. All cars eat gas and things like that, as opposed to just trying to do it in successive order like this. But this is a grand indication to show you that yes, it all does make sense. There's a reason that those notes are named that way, and they all connect and make sense. Okay, so let's recap everything that we talked about, just kind of giving a brief overview here. We talked about the 5 lines and 4 spaces, okay? So again, there's your 5 lines, and then the spaces are in between those red lines. Okay, then we talked about the clefs, treble clef, bass clef, then our movable C clef. What we have shown there right there is actually the alto clef, but remember we can move that all over the place, and wherever that little indentation is, that indicates that that line is C. And then we also learned about the percussion clef, which has no pitch reference. It's just you put rhythms there, and it indicates, you know, on such and such line or space is a certain drum. And that can vary from composer to composer. There is some, I guess, trying to get into a stabilized normalcy within all of that, but it's still a work in progress. Okay, and then the next thing we talked about was the names of the notes. Here they are in the treble clef, includes the no man's land. Here it is in bass clef. And then we talked about the ledger lines. Remember, it is adding areas above and below the natural 5 lines, 4 spaces. And again, you can do the same thing within bass clef. Again, adds notes with above and below the staff. And then lastly, we talked about the grand staff. Middle C being right smack dab in the middle, connecting both staves and clefs together. Okay, so as with all tutorials, something you don't understand, go back, rewind, find that area, and play it over until you understand the concept and move on. Also encourage you to find areas where you can practice these things. Practice makes not necessarily perfect, but permanent, so make sure you learn it the right way. Find exercises and games and things like that that you can use to help ingrain these things in your brain, and also to practice these so that you know it like the back of your hand. All right, we'll see you again next time.